just the rainwater.
Yes.
How in the hell do you edit a comic? Because it's my understanding that you plan everything out pretty much perfect. Then you just do it, and then it's done. Right?
That depends on how professional a person you're talking to.
Okay.
The planning thing, I would say that I'm kind of in a different ballpark in terms of how much planning goes into what I do. So
Okay.
your original question though was about editing, right? So
Yes.
I would say I do a ton of editing because of the way that I work in my process. So I would say, so for instance, let's say that you were working as a penciler for DC Comics. You're doing a Batman comic. You're working with writer Grant Morrison. He's going to have very thorough scripts. So there's going to be a very definitive back and forth process between you and the writer, with the editor watching, like, there's a person paid as an overseer of the project called an editor. Oftentimes in movies, we would call this person a producer, or music a producer. Anyway, point being, there is a lot of oversight as to step what's going on between the beginning of the script, right? Because so let's say Grant Morrison writes the script, he has to send it to the editor looks through it, gives it the okay, then sends the script over to the penciler. The penciler goes over the script, makes thumbnails, which are very loose, coming out with panel layouts, just trying to figure out where everything's going to be positioned very loosely, sends it to the editor looks at it, gives it the okay, and then goes to the next step, and rinse repeat that process every step of the way. So for something like more established, I guess I would say, I don't know how to define this, as we know as print comics, you know what I mean, where there's a very thin profit margin, so everything has to be to the T, just looked over and very consistently made sure that the quality is qualified from step to step. Like I was saying, there's a lot of looking over the shoulders of the creators. I'm in a slightly different boat. With Webtoon, I have an incredible amount of liberty as to what I can do in a given page, or in a given episode, what I can write, what I can say. I've only ever once gotten a message from an editor saying, "Hey, we need you to change this picture," and it was because we could see Jake Baker's ghost butt. So we couldn't see the divot of his butt. I had to change that, basically, much to the chagrin of many of my fans who like Jake's butt, and there's apparently a lot of them. But anyway, to get further into your question, so I've described sort of the editing process and the more institutional, standardized, whatever you want to call it, comics, the more established comics medium. For me, I have to figure out a lot of my own editing process myself. And the editors that I work with Webtoon, they do a fair amount of proofreading, and they just make sure that everything's reading appropriately. There's no mess in the pacing. I cannot say I've ever gotten any notes ever about narrative, in terms of narrative issues. Either that's because I'm a great writer, or that's just they're as part of their job, that's not something that they're told to be responsible for. So I myself have to be pretty much the person who decides what makes the cut, right, when it's finally put in front of the audience. And one of the benefits, I guess, of that format is that I can retroactively go back to an already published episode and make changes. So
Wow. You
yeah,
can George Lucas it.
yeah, exactly. I had actually an issue where like one of the characters, her hair color was not dark enough, so I had to I went back and like just change the shade of it darker to make it actually like look better. That's just one example. So another example is I still will find like misspellings, or I will find like just some little image or something in the background that needs to be changed, or some continuity error. There's like one continuity error I can still think of that's still out there that unless you're paying a lot of attention, you're not going to notice. But when a character's ear like changes shape from one panel to the next, and I have to go like at one day I'm going to go back and fix that. Special commendations to the person who replies to this post and finds that panel again in the comments. Say directly what it is, where it is, what episode. Anyway, so hopefully that I felt like that might have been a thorough answer to your question in terms of editing comics. I guess I would say lastly that I mean it's not just proofreading, right? It's like sometimes I'm changing the arrangement of panels because I think, oh, this moment would work better if I did it either before or after, which is something that's kind of, I mean, I think I'm actually going to jump ahead and kind of say and kind of ask you, Jao, like if you have an experience similar for yourself in editing in video, where it's like the ways that you can arrange moment to moment are very fluid, very plastic. Where, like, do you ever experiment with that? And this is kind of a different sense of editing, right? I guess this is sort of where we get into. There's two ways to use that term, right? Where it's like how you arrange things, and then also how you fix things up, basically to make a better product, essentially.
Yeah, when you're an editor, you're basically an artistic surgeon.
Yeah.
And you're in there and you're dealing with problems that shouldn't be there, that should be there, that don't have to be there, which there are a difference. There is a difference between that and some of the ones I listed before. But like, so example, when I shot Digits, and a lot of people that are probably listening to this may have seen that movie. It was a first time director, and I was very easily influenceable. I did not want to be an uppity director, and one of the main reasons, which I do not recommend, I made the movie was because I wanted to make some friends in the general industry that I was wanting to get into. And so doing so, I was very liberal with the idea of them doing improv. And when I say them, I mean the fucking actors. Do not do this, especially if you are the editor, because what will end up happening is things start happening that you cannot work together, that it's either creating a nightmare for you because you don't have something that you needed, or you have something that you want, but it doesn't fit because the other stuff that you created surrounding it doesn't match up. So like I had a take where somebody was doing something during a party scene and they were just at the table giving this speech, rallying this whole crowd and all this kind of stuff. And then they asked for an improv take, and of course I was like, sure. And they jumped on the table in that take. And they gave a great performance, and I was like, this is fucking awesome. I want to use this. The problem was all of the reaction shots for everybody around them had been based off of the master shot where they had just been standing at the table.
Yeah.
So the eye lines would have been, everyone would have been staring at that person's crotch for that particular scene if I needed to cut around things. Right. So that didn't work. Yeah. And it was so sad because the performance in that particular take was so much better than the one at the table. And I was like, damn it, I wish I had that. And it's not something that you necessarily have a luxury of, especially in shoestring budget independent film, to think in that moment to just say, oh, we need reaction shots of everyone's eye lines looking up on the angle, but also do we have the time to get that shot?
Yeah.
So that creates problems. And then there's also things like when you don't have a script supervisor paying attention that just don't match up. Somebody says a line slightly differently. Maybe it's because the actor is trying to mix things up. Things just don't match and it doesn't work. And then they add lines, they forget lines, all that kind of stuff becomes problems because then you have to cut to something else, then you have to cut back to them. If it's a different angle from where you were previously, you need to make sure you're not violating the 180 line. I don't know if you guys have that in comics.
No, that's in comics too, for sure.
The 2D line that you cannot cross unless you, of course, find a reason and use some kind of transitional shot to do it. So, like, there's a million things, but the number one thing that I was really kind of curious about for the comics was in film, you need to capture when you're on set necessarily, not necessarily in the scripting phase, but when you're on set, you actually need to capture what's called handles, which is something a little bit more than what you're there for on both sides of the beginning and the end of the take. That will allow you a lot more liberty in terms of how you move within a scene, the rhythm and pacing. Now, I know there are rhythm and pacing in comics. I'm guessing it's coming from the size of the frame on the page that kind of dictates the pacing.
Yeah.
But for filmmaking, it's how soon you make the cuts. So sometimes you want that little bit of leeway, and it doesn't cost very much to get a little bit before, a little bit after, and it gives you that kind of handle to move with. The problem is sometimes you get a little superfluous with it, and it gets way out of hand. So the real thing that I was wondering is if there are extraneous creations that are intentionally created when devising the planning of a comic that get removed later on. Because we should be straight with our audience right now. The whole process of editing is to narrow, is to kind of make sure that the story is staying in focus. The emotion is in focus. Everything else is whipped cream and butterflies. Like it doesn't, it's like crazy secondary. If the audience doesn't understand what's going on or what the point is, it doesn't matter how stylistic your editing, your transitions are, or your shot design is, or whatever like that. They don't give a shit, and they're not even paying attention to it because they're trying to figure out what's going on. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So in filmmaking, that can get away from you very quickly if you're not on top of it. That's why editors are the unsung heroes. And I get it. Part of their job is to be invisible. If you don't notice that the editing is amazing, then they did their job. That's the last thing that you need on a film is a diva editor who's like, I want everyone to know my name. Like that'll fuck your film up real quick. But I guess it's different in comics because you don't need to draw the outsides of a panel or extra panels that get cut.
Well, actually,
on purpose is what I'm saying. Like creating them on purpose, just to get cut.
I was going to say the one exception I can think to that is in print comics. There's what's called bleed space. So sometimes you'll have a page where the image, like usually if let's say you have like a 9-panel setup and it's just 9 rectangles on the page, right? And they're all contained within the white of the page, or what we would like to call the gutter space.
Yeah.
Sometimes, and this is something that kind of came around more as manga became more popular in the United States, because manga did this previously, more aggressively than a lot of U.S. comics. There's what's called bleed space. So that's like when the comic goes to print, there is a portion of the page that gets just sliced off. It's like a point of no return on the page, It's usually measured in such a way that you have a little bit of error, because there's always going to be some amount of like things get shifted around on the print plates and all this other stuff. Well, anyway, a lot of artists, and I'll just say particularly manga artists, found that you could create very dramatic effects by having the image bleed off of the page for certain panels, and it gives it more impact versus other panels that are contained within the white space and within the gutter.
It's the IMAX of comic books.
Yes, and that exactly. And that's where I would say that you have a lot of material that's just like not seen at all, like, in the finished product. Because you have some background elements. It's all stuff that the artist knowingly is putting there, knowing that it's going to be cut out, right? But that is the best example I can think of in comics, where it's like you have material created that's never going to really see the light of day, and it's there as buffer, basically, to allow for the overall, the overall piece to come together. Beyond that, the only other thing I can think of is, like, in terms of writing, there have definitely been instances where there's been like extraneous dialogue for me, and this is speaking for me personally, where there's extraneous dialogue that, like, I'll have in a script thinking, having it there mostly for if I have the space for it, I'd like to fit it in, but it's not necessary. And it helps me from a creative standpoint. It helps me figure out, like, okay, where am I wanting to go with the scene, stuff like that. But that's more, I'd say that's more pre-production type stuff, and less like, when you're in the thick of it, where it sounds like what you're talking about with videography, or with doing the camera work, where it's like you're talking about something, from the way that I'm hearing it, you're talking about something very specifically that is almost like a functional part of the whole process, whereas if you don't do it, you could really mess up the whole thing down the line, basically. Is that correct?
There was a mantra that my high school video production teacher taught me, and I live by this till this day when it comes to when I'm on set, when I'm writing, whatever, which is, and this is big because for you in the comic book world, I'm sure it's going to sound like I'm downplaying it more than I am. I'm not. I know that it's still a headache and a half and a hassle and costs money and this and that. But for you, if you realize something is missing,
yeah,
it's not entirely crazy for you to go back and say, okay, I need to, cut this frame down and move a panel in here and add this and da 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 da.
Oh yeah, I've done it a lot. I've done it a fair amount. I had in the last season of Trailer Park Warlock, I added like 15 panels at the end of one episode.
Holy
like
shit.
A couple weeks later, after I'd gotten feedback from readers where they were like, this transition isn't working. I was like, okay, there's clearly something missing. I'm going to add these 15 panels just to patch it up a little bit, so that you'll have it, mostly not for the current readers, but for new readers coming on down the line. Because in my mind, I'm thinking long term, like, there's going to always be more and more people coming into it, right? And
Amen.
I have this privilege of, like, being able to just kind of George Lucas it as I go along and add and adjust where I need to. But I'm sorry.
At least they didn't turn on you for doing that, though. They actually wanted you to do it. That is the difference. But no, that's my point, is like, it's a headache, it's a hassle, it's possible, and it's costly in terms of time and stuff like that. Now, I'm sure for like a print comic, but it would probably be costly to print new pages and this and that. But for filmmaking, you can't go back most of the time to the set. The actor has dyed their hair and cut it. Or in the case of Henry Cavill, he's grown a mustache and can't shave it off to play Superman. Things like that. So there was a mantra that my video production teacher taught me, which was better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it.
That is a great mantra to have. I like that a lot. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Joe.
it's crazy. I mean, it's very indulgent, and almost wasteful, to an extent, because I could probably, from all the footage that I captured for Digits, I could probably do an alternate cut and use maybe 30% of the existing movie, and the remaining 70% would be alternate angles from different takes.
Release the Casarco cut.
Never. But that's the thing, is like that's how I went about it, and I would absolutely recommend that to anyone who's doing filmmaking. I would never, ever, 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 ever wrap early on a day. If you're ahead of schedule, get some other shit. You're paying everyone to be there. They're being paid regardless. Get out on time. Don't go overtime, but get all kinds of stuff. You know what I mean? Get it. Because, and that's the editors. Sure, an editor might think it might sound good on paper. Oh, you just gave me exactly what I need. But there's also an artistry to editing, where every artist wants to contribute when you're in a collaboration, especially on filmmaking. So like an actor will come to you and say, "Hey, I wondered if I could change this line a little bit like this. Can I just say it like this?" Blah blah blah. Cinematographer comes to you, "Hey, I was thinking about this shot instead of that shot." Blah blah blah. If you give the editor exactly what was planned, the editor can't go, "Oh, well, I was going to do a J cut here, and then we could have just drawn out the master a little bit, and then if we cut to this, then it makes the illusion that he's going to kill him, and that makes it a little bit." You know what I mean? Like, they can't contribute when their hands are tied. So the more you get, there's more movability in the edit that you have to create things that you maybe hadn't realized before, to solve problems that you didn't realize were there or do realize that there are there. And those kinds of things start becoming helpful. Now, again, like all things, if you're not on your game, if you're not focused, it's easy to get lost in the weeds. You can get really artsy with the edit and totally lose the ball about what you're trying to do. But for me, when I come to editing, I follow the Walter Murch. It's like an order of operations for editing that he goes by, and it's a process. And the number one thing that dictates his edits is the emotion of the scene. So like whatever's going on emotionally, that's priority one. Maintain that priority no matter what, in spite of the following priorities. So the second thing that you would want to try and keep in line after that, is the story, which makes sense. You know what I mean? If people get lost in the emotion of what's going on, they're not really thinking about plot, or anything like that. But emotions number one, stories number second.
The emotions what gets people into the plot ultimately, because really, I mean, at least from my perspective, the plot's almost like the rails on the roller coaster, and the emotions like the ups and the downs and the turns and all that stuff, basically.
Yes, that's a great way to describe it. Because if I'm not enjoying the roller coaster, I don't give a shit how many curves and how much it goes ups and down and all that kind of stuff. So no, I absolutely get that. Number three, and this is where you start getting artsy, rhythm.
Yeah.
Which is important in filmmaking, maybe a little bit more than other mediums, because you're always operating under the suspension of disbelief when it comes to filmmaking. There cannot be a false note. So it's a tricky high wire act to do a rhythmic type of editing where you got some style going on, but also the audience isn't noticing that it's happening, that it's kind of fucking with their subconscious on on a level that they're not consciously aware of, obviously. And then getting creative with it. Do you know what I mean? Because how often have people sat in a movie and they, at a certain point in the movie, they're looking at their watch going, Jesus, how much more of this fucking thing is there? And there could be 10 minutes left. There could be an hour 45. The problem is the rhythm there isn't matching where you are in the story.
Yeah.
And on a level, you're supposed to be communicating with your audience. Hey, we're getting there. This is almost the end. See how it's kind of ramping up now? And that's important. That's, what I mean? That's when the cell phones whip out in movies. is when people are like, oh, I wonder what's going on Facebook. I'm going to be here for a while. If you know in your heart of hearts and you care, if you know, hey, this is the end, all right, I can wait 5 minutes for my phone. Unless, there's a life or death phone call on the way.
Yeah.
I can wait. I can, you know what I mean? But if I'm thinking, okay, there's another hour 45, nothing really is going on, it's not really kind of getting there, I'll check Facebook. And that's when the phone comes out.
Well, it's interesting that you bring all that up too, because so you had talked about Dunkirk in a previous episode of the show as an excellent example of editing, like storytelling through editing. So I finally watched it, and I definitely see what you mean. I think the way you put it is it tells the story through editing to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And it's the way that everything's arranged, because I mean, you could watch that story in so many different ways, but it was told in a very specific way, and it's told in a way that I think where it's laid out in terms of emotional beats instead of like linear time-wise beats.
Yep.
I thought that was really fascinating because I felt like while I was watching that story, it was like you got to see this particular battle take place sort of as a whole organism rather than just like, we go from here to here to here to here as like a to B process. It was more like an A to C to B to C to A, So it had like a very unique rhythm to it that I hadn't seen in other movies.
Yep.
And I'm curious for you if you had any other like personal recommendations in regards to film work that uses editing in that kind of sense.
Something, for the storytelling aspect, Dunkirk is definitely, a phenomenal example of how you can use editing to control the story, to control, and this is why I think you were going to love it, Rainwater, was the edit of that film subverts expectations. That is a subverted edit. No one, you know what I mean? When you go to a movie, you have a general idea of how the editing is going to go. There'll be flashbacks, flash forwards, yada, yada, all that kind of shit. But the way it was handled, it was like a juggle in that movie but you didn't know it. And that's the beautiful thing about it. You did not know it until a certain point in the movie. Spoiler alert. Oddly enough, we were just talking about this in a recent podcast, but the editing in Scott Pilgrim versus the World is truly fucking great. And it's from a transitional point of view. That's the beauty of the editing in that film, is that a lot of filmmakers, especially amateur ones, and this is something that I catch myself when I was watching Digits. It was a lesson that I caught and taught myself by observing my own work. My transitions from scene to scene were kind of hard, and it'll very much take you out of the film. So one of the things when I was fixing Haunted, I talk all the time about the first draft of Haunted was rejected from every film festival I submitted it to. The first thing I did was I looked at all of the scene transitions. What was the last thing said in this scene? What was the last mental image I left the reader with? And then what did I go to? And I was doing the same thing I had done in Digits, and that was the first thing I fixed. Scott Pilgrim is a master of that thing, where they transition from one scene to another brilliantly in a way that keeps the story going in a rhythm where you never get bored. At least for me. I don't know about you. Like, they cut out the fat, which is the beauty. That's the whole point of editing, is to keep it focused on what's going on. And a lot of amateur filmmakers and storytellers get caught up in I have to tell that he went from his house to her house. So I have to get a shot of him walking down the street, and he's got to wait at the red light, and it sucks. And then he finally gets to her house. No, Scott Pilgrim is like, he's in the middle of a conversation with one person, and then boom, they match cut, and it's a different person at a different house, different conversation, moving the plot and the characters forward, not wasting any fucking time. Brevity is the Jesus, what's the quote?
Brevity is the soul of wit.
That's it. Thank you. It would not be a Midnight at the Spaghetti Factory episode if I did not start saying something and forget what it was in the middle of it.
Well, you know,
But
another example that this is starting to get some examples in my head that I'm thinking about now, which is so a lot of the older Simon Pegg, Nick Frost movies like Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz,
also
both
Edgar Wright.
those are all Edgar Wright films, you're saying, along with Scott
Probably.
Pilgrim.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have very punchy editing, right? Where it's like
Yep.
you're going from scene to scene to scene, you're getting the story immediately. And I love the way that they do those films because it's never a boring moment. And
Mhm.
it, like I was going back to, like I was saying earlier, it's sort of that, I don't know, it's different from a roller coaster, maybe. It's a little bit more like, it's a little bit, or maybe it's just a very intense roller coaster where they're very high, like peaks and troughs. You know what I mean? Where the turns are almost instantaneous when you're going through the story. Yeah, that's a really I like the way that you're saying that and talking about it because that is also another good example of editing and in laying out a story using rhythm, right? That's like one of the things that makes those stories really stand out is they have this very intense and punchy rhythm to them that it's almost like a punk rock song. Is the best description I can come
Yeah.
up with. Um, and in comics, this is interesting too because in comics, like I can't quite find the same. It's not quite the same analogy, but you can in terms of how you lay out a page. You can set up a rhythm to the page. And it really depends. This is going back to what we were talking about with gutter space. It really depends on how you arrange those things and also whether or not you even use the gutter space at all. So there's a run of Swamp Thing that Alan Moore did way back in the 70s. And as part of his like run on that comic, the way he made sure to have it written and the artist that he was working with, they got rid of a lot of gutters. Everything kind of flowed into each other. So it was almost like you had one image, or the page was just one big image, but
Yeah.
the way everything was separated was like almost montage like where you're going from piece to piece. And it's all readable as like this one flowing psychedelic moment. That is one example of how you can change the rhythm in pace in comics. And I guess like I don't know, we could talk forever about rhythm and pace in terms of editing. But I'm wondering for you, are there any other like very important aspects of editing outside of just that really exemplify, how you choose a moment and how you choose a set of moments together? Because something that I see in cinema that you're talking about that I think is really unique to cinema in comparison to like more into like a visual art is there's so much from the sound of it, there's so much material that you're kind of playing with almost like Play-Doh. Is that an acceptable analogy?
Yes. There's been times like again, I go back to digits mostly because it's the main thing that I've edited, or at least that I would want to talk about. I've edited multiple things, but some I can talk about, some I just don't want to. But the point I'm getting at is I've rearranged scenes entirely. I mean, obviously there's a physical component that's kind of locking you in things. Like, if you wanted to change that up, all you need to do is erase it. Again, I can't go back and get my actors and do this and that unless I've got a giant Hollywood budget, which they were smart enough to start building reshoots into the initial budget. So that way they could go back and do that, and schedules now expect that it's going to happen and so on and so forth. But I can't do that. But once you get like the two characters walk into a room, they sit down and they eat. Well, once they're at the table, you're a little bit more in that free flowing thing. So you could swap around some lines and this and that and play with it so that it makes better emotional sense. Now, if you are a director and you know what the fuck you're doing, you will have control of your actors on set and you will make sure that they are hitting the right notes at the right points, and the actors will be aware and giving to each other and taking from each other and emotionally riding that wave so that it's easy enough as it is. Sometimes it just doesn't happen. Some actors just don't work well with other actors. Some directors give too much general direction and the actors don't know what's happening, and it becomes the duty of the editor to fix it. And then the director looks like a brilliant person. I've had issues. I can't name the movie off the top of my head, but I have had movies where I've gone to them high expectations thinking, man, this movie's going to be good. Because I know who the writer is, I know who the director is, I know who the cinematographer is, and I know who the producer is. Like, I'll name people or whatever, and I'll look at it, and I'll be like, this movie fucking blows. And everybody else is like, yeah, it wasn't good, blah, blah, blah. But they can't put their finger on it, and I'll go on IMDb, I'll be like, I know him, I know him, I know him, I know, like, this guy hits the mark every time, blah, 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 blah. Then I'll go to the editor, and I'll see the editor's name, and I'll go, okay, I wonder what else they did. Click on it, and I'll look, and it's just a bunch of shit movies that I've seen, and I'm like, these are horrible. I'm like, that's it. The editor fucked it up.
Yeah.
And I mean, granted, the director should be working with the editor in the actual edit bay, but sometimes a lot of what people don't know is that a director sometimes isn't always hands-on in the edit. They will hand it off to the editor, and then they'll go start pre-production on their next film. Or, you know what I mean? Or
which is really fascinating to me, because I look at that and I think, like, well, that's the actual putting the fucking thing together. Like,
that's the making of the movie. Sure. Yeah. That's basically production is just going to the store and getting all the paints and the brushes and the canvas
like the
that you
IKEA.
need. And
they put together the IKEA box and then maybe give you some directions, and then as the editor, you have to, like, basically
make the movie.
Yeah, on your own.
That's why they call it a film. Absolutely, it's on film. Well, at least it used to be. No, but that's sometimes what happens. Or a producer will hijack an edit bay, and they will be like, "No, the director's not in here. We're not letting him. We're not. They've literally locked the doors, so directors could not get in and tamper with an editor or anything like that." Yeah. So it's so crazy that stuff like that can happen. But yes, that's really when all the play starts coming in. One of our favorite YouTube channels, both you and I have discussed this numerous times, Red Letter Media. Mike and Jay talk about it all the time. One of their favorite things to do is the edit. And I will go ahead and say, out of all the YouTube celebrities in the world, their movie reviews and this and that are several levels above others because they've moved past just doing jump cuts and talking people. They will cut to different things. They will, you know what I mean? Like, their editing is top fucking notch.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Just to make jokes, and that's what makes it entertaining, is that they take that time to go in there and play. Because otherwise, it's just two guys sitting there talking about a movie, which everyone on the internet does. But when they go back and they add that they sweeten it, is what's the film term of it called. Most of the time, that means adding like sound effects and music and this and that. But for them, it's adding cutaways and adding, juxtaposing footage from the movie that makes things, takes it out of context. That's another beautiful thing about editing is, and I think I've talked about this before, is I can show you the picture of an old man and then cut to a picture of a dog looking kind of sad. And immediately in your brain, that juxtaposition of those two images makes you think, oh, the old man has to put the dog down and he feels bad about it and the dog is dying. That's sad. But if I showed you the picture of the old man and then I cut to a swing set, suddenly the old man is reminiscing about his childhood or maybe a kid that he lost or something. You know what I mean? Like that wonderful juxtaposition in film. I don't know if that so much happens in comics. Comics, to me, from what I've read, and I'm very limited, I'll admit, with comic book reading, but is most of the time very linear when it comes to stuff like that. It's usually a direct visual of like the physical space.
Yeah, it's very hard.
To do flashbacks and stuff like that. You can't do the out of focus sound effect and shit like that to make, hey, this is a flashback. Like, it's harder to do.
I don't think it's impossible to do nonlinear storytelling in comics, but it is very difficult because, like you're saying,
harder. Oh, absolutely.
It's directly linked to the fact that based on your language, right? It's whatever your program to read it is based on your language, right? So like you're English, left to right. If you're Japanese, right to left. You know what I mean? So like that is like a hardcore what's the word, like imprint for any reading person.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to break it. So I think that's part of that aspect, right, of reading comics. And so I have to say, like, with what you're saying, what you're talking about, and I have been Bat Monster, I've been trying to kind of toy with that a little bit. Not not like a whole lot, but I will say, an ambition me and Austin have had, if we ever were to make a print version of Bat Monster, is to release each book with no numbers. Like, there's no linear arrangement to the story. Like, you figure out how each book goes together. Because the way it's written is you can kind of piece it together however you want. And so our idea was
that's kind of crazy.
Yeah, it would be to see what kind of stories or what kind of connections people make between events, between books, right?
Wow.
Instead of like telling the audience what those connections should be. And that to me is like, I would love to mess around with that more, but that's like that's the kind of experimental stuff that makes $0. You can make $0 off of when you have spare time. And Bat Monster is one of those projects where both me and Austin were fortunate to have the spare time and resources at the time that we started that project. Not so much anymore. Fortunately, we're almost done with it, so like it's not that big of a deal. But that might be in the future something that I mess around with more in another project. Anyway, going back to your point, yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting as we're talking about this too. Like something that I'm thinking about also is it gives me an odd amount of respect for a lot of like B-movie like creators, because I'm kind of like, oh, they were at least good enough at like Neil Brain is at least a good enough editor for me to like make a coherent story out of what he's saying. The story itself is terrible, but like I understand what's going on. I'm not confused. Like
you would be astounded at how many filmmakers cannot tell a coherent story. Coherent. Like, I will take the fucking amateur film school, wakes up in the morning, hits his alarm clock, brushes his teeth, takes a shower, goes to work. I will take that shit over some of the other stuff any other day. Have you ever watched a movie called Things?
No.
Okay, don't. Just don't. But there are a lot of people, and this is also where I hesitate to call them pretentious, because that means there's thought going into it. But some people will just do stuff and they don't understand that there are very subtle things going on when you're watching an edit. Again, the mark of a good editor that you don't realize. The next time you watch a movie, right, that you've already seen a bajillion times, right? Pay attention to something called a J cut or an L cut. Now I'm going to explain what that is.
Yeah.
It is a transitional technique that film editors use where the audio from the next scene will start playing before the shot cuts away to the next scene. Vice versa for the L cut, the audio from the current scene will keep playing even though we've cut to the next scene. And that's the kind of shit people don't notice is happening when it happens. And some people just think, oh, someone's done talking, cut, go to the next thing. And that's where the very mundane editing gets brought in. Somebody walks from here to there. So I'm going to wait until he gets to there, cut, he's there. No. You cut on action. You cut on the movement, and then you match that action, and it creates that perception of motion. Because in essence, and this is the number one thing that they taught me at film school, which is you're not watching you're not watching real life. You're watching a bunch of pictures moving really so fast that you aren't noticing that there's a little tiny nanosecond of black in between every single one of them.
Yeah.
And that illusion is what's creating the story in your head. And there's so many things that you can do to kind of amplify that illusion is happening so that you don't jump back and say, oh, I'm watching a movie. And that's
so if
one
I
of the things,
understand, I was just going to ask, so if I understand correctly, sort of the mechanism behind J cuts and L cuts, the idea is you're using audio to basically act as glue between scenes so that it's not abrupt.
yes,
For an audience.
absolutely.
Okay.
Abrupt is, in order for something abrupt, for an edit to be abrupt, it needs to be a reflection of what's going on in the story.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? You know what I'm saying? Like if you do a hard cut on something where it's just like, boom, cut to something, that needs to be a moment that's so powerful. You're still thinking about that moment. Again, the Walter Murch kind of order of operations, which is I'm thinking about that moment and not about the cut. The cut is the MSG sprinkled on top of it. It's making that flavor pop on that moment. So that when we watch it, it's kind of a language between the audience and the editor. The editor is telling you, hey, this is an important moment. You already knew it was an important moment, but when we watch something, you want that confirmation. You know what I'm saying? Like you want them to acknowledge that you are feeling the right emotion in that moment, because otherwise you start looking at the person next to you. Oh, did you get that? Did you understand what's going on? Like, but if you get that hard cut, you're like, oh, I got it.
Because the first thought that started going into my mind is, how could I implement that into comics? Because I can't think of too many instances. I mean, maybe a couple, but I can start to think the most immediate thing that occurred to me is like, okay, you could potentially stretch out sound effects from one panel to the next if there was an action that would make sense to do that. But
yes,
that's really interesting. Sorry, I'm kind of not to digress too much, but
I'm sure there's a way to transmute everything from one medium to another. I'm a religious nut about that ideal, that everything can translate from one medium to another. Match cuts are another thing. So I don't know a scene right off the top of my head, but like for example, if you're watching the movie Rocky, and Rocky goes back to his apartment and he finds an eviction notice on his door, and he walks in, and then you like imagine this was a comic book, and he walks into the room and he's reading the note, and you have a shot of the note, and then it comes back and you have Rocky rearing back like he's about to punch the wall, right? And he's right about to hit the wall, and then the next panel you just have like the point of view of Rocky on another boxer falling back, flailing, and you've cut automatically into Rocky's next fight. Do you know what I'm saying? Like that's the idea of like a match cut, and I could see visually that working in a comic better than a sound transition, just because it's not. But I guess it's like you were saying, like if you had something where there was like a buzz noise and you had the Z's going or whatever like that, and say it was like a bunch of bees, like the bug, a bee, a bunch of hives or something like that, and then all of a sudden the Z's transition over, and then the next frame is just somebody sleeping. You know what I'm saying? Like
that's exactly that was one of the first ideas that came up in my mind. Well, so I guess I'm thinking about like all this is really interesting, thinking about really ultimately it seems to me like editing as a practice, as a craft, is about how you manipulate time. So like if you're in comics, you manipulate time through position, right? And it's related to the page. So you could, in theory, reorient an entire narrative based on how you reposition all your elements on the page, and your elements being, your images. In cinema, it's not about position. It's very strictly in terms of timeline, and also in terms of sound, right? Those seem to be the major elements that are your main ways of like manipulating how things transition. I don't know. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, there's also something to be said about giving or like hiding and revealing. That's the way to describe it.
Okay.
Because sometimes for comics, you kind of to dictate the pace. I guess it's the same for film, but to dictate the pace, you do need to change shots quite a bit. Um, but if I'm, having someone else give a giant monologue, most of the time I can dictate where that shot is going most of the time because the audio can underlay under multiple shots. Whereas for you, if you have a giant monologue and don't want that monologue to be interrupted, like the flow of that monologue, you want
Yeah.
somebody rereading it, you need one giant panel.
Yeah.
And you can't cross cut or anything like that. You need to stay with whatever that one panel is, that one shot's got to hold for that. For me, I can hold on something else. I can cut to something else, and I can keep that audio going fluently. And that's I don't know where I'm going with that.
There are ways to mess with that where you wouldn't have to have it just be one panel. You could you have to be able to do it in such a way where you're making sure that the audience can associate all the word balloons with the speaker. It's not too hard because usually the assumption is the person reading will usually make the assumption that so long as you don't see somebody else speaking, they're going to assume that the first speaker is the current speaker as you go on, as you progress further in the storytelling. So it is possible to cut away. I think you do have to be a little more careful than you would in a movie where it's like everybody acknowledges who the speaker is because the voice is very signature, right, to the person who's speaking. That is definitely a different. I think that. Go ahead.
The point that I'm making, which I couldn't pontificate until you started talking.
Yeah.
So that helped me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is that for you, dialogue and shot design are the same thing. They're both visual.
Yes.
For me, one is audible, one is visual. So I can, you know what I mean? When you do a giant monologue, yes, you can break up the shots and everything like that, but I have to stop reading the dialogue to look at the shot to understand what it is. And then I go back to the dialogue. So I'm breaking up the pace by doing that.
Yeah.
Whereas with a movie, and this is why I get into a giant disagreement with a lot of people about this, and apparently I'm in a giant minority, and I'm willing to admit it. I am a bigger fan of bad dubs in movies than I am subtitles because the dubs not only allow me to stay visually connected to the shot design and the action and the story of what's going on visually, but also there's a thing about, and I know you can do this in comics, but it's a little bit harder to get across, which is like things like inflection and things like that start becoming an issue when you have what are they called? Subtitles, excuse me.
Sure.
Which is basically what comics have.
Because
which is just,
with
the whole thing
subtitles, what you're saying makes sense. And it really depends on the movie for me. It really depends on, any particular situation. And for me, like that's come up most with like anime. But what you're saying is a fair point, which is that subtitles become a visual element on the screen, right? And so become a point of where you have to pay attention while you're also watching the movie, and it can make it it can be distracting. It can make it more difficult to take the movie in. I will say that there have been movies that I've watched where the dub becomes a distraction, like a complete.
Yes.
It's not.
I'm not going to contest that.
It really depends on the situation for sure, and it's very touch and go where it's like it just depends on who's doing it when, because for anime there are like Akira is one example. It's as an anime movie, it is like one of those cornerstones of anime, but there are multiple dubs of it, and there are camps on like which dub is better, whether it's like the older, I think like 1980s version or like the newer one that I think was done in like the in the late 90s or early aughts. And then you have people who are like, well, fuck both of those. The subtitles is where it's at because that's like the, the authentic version. And then that becomes a whole debate because really, what are you, then you're arguing about whether or not the person who did the translation actually did it well. So like another example is the movie Princess Mononoke. Interestingly enough, Neil Gaiman, who is the comics writer Neil Gaiman, not just comics but fantasy, and he's written a bunch of other things, did the I guess I'll just say the subtitle right for Princess Mononoke, but I don't think he was the one who did the actual translation. There was somebody who translated, like this is like the Bible, where it's like somebody translated and then somebody interpreted the translation to give proper context, like emotional context to everything that was going on in the scene.
So it's not even like the Bible, it's like the Good News Bible, where they've taken everything
exactly.
and they've put it into plain English, like modern day English, so that people who are very simple could understand it.
It's another version of editing, right? Because editing is ultimately about how you interpret. So now I'm going against my initial thesis, right, which was about manipulating time. Now I'm saying editing is about how you interpret all the different perspectives going into the work, right? An editor has to, like in a film, an editor has to take the perspectives of the actors, the director, the producer, the executive producer,
the MPAA.
Yeah, like everybody's intentions. They have to take everybody's intentions into account, and then somehow, through magic,
make sense of it.
Yeah, make sense of all of it. I would not begrudge or I would not envy that position because it sounds intimidating.
You also have to, then beyond that, you also have to take into consideration, and this how we've gone 57 minutes without talking about this, I don't know. But you also have to take into consideration that once it's making sense, like it's getting the point across, it still has to be executed good. Like, and I mean, I realize good is, in the eye of the beholder, but 57 minutes we've gone and we have not talked about in our editing episode the Snyder cut. I mean, we joked about the Casarco cut, but you look at something and you look at two different directors, and one of them kind of hopped on and stole the project. Not really, but you know what I mean. Yeah. 3/4 of the way down the finish line and changed it fucking drastically. Now, did that movie still make sense? Yes. Was it good? Depends on who you ask. Then you get the Snyder cut, which was the original director coming back on. Not only did that motherfucker finish what he had originally intended, but he also shot additional shit after the fact to add in because fuck it. And
which is quite a task. Like, all right, go ahead, Joe.
I was just going to say, it's kind of shocking because I've hated his last two WB movies. I've hated Man of Steel and I hated Batman v Superman. When they did the director's cut of Batman v Superman, I was willing to admit it was better than the theatrical cut. Still was not my cup of tea. The Justice League, on the other hand, total fucking, like, I was 1000% on board with his cut of the movie. I was like, this is fucking great. I love this. Like, every moment of this works. And it's crazy because some of the time it's the same footage. You know what I mean? It's color graded a little bit differently. There's, they cut into a shot later or sooner or whatever. But it's most of the time it's even the same takes. And it hits differently because of the assembly, how they were able to execute those shots, the juxtaposition of other shots, music, sound effects, yada, yada, yada. But the edit was different and the edit hit different because of it. And a lot of it was the same shit. So it's very interesting to me. You know what I mean? Like, if I gave like you the footage to digits and I said, Rainwater, cut this movie up, you're going to come up with a completely different, you might even come up with a different story.
That was something I was starting to think about, which would be fascinating to me, would be if like older directors kind of got to a point where like, fuck it with making new movies. Let's just give each other reels of each other's movies and we'll put together whatever we think is, our version of that footage.
I believe it was either Topher Grace or Adrian Brody. I can't remember. Not Adrian Brody. It was one of the fucking CW kids. I don't remember his name. I think he played Eric on That 70s Show. Was that Topher Grace?
I'm not
I don't know.
Actor names, yeah.
But I think you know who I'm talking about. It's one of those little nerdy kind of teen beat looking dudes. It was a big thing on the internet for a while, and I think you could only get it on like Pirate Bay if you downloaded the torrent or whatever. But took the original three, not the original, but the 3 Star Wars prequels, and ripped them from their discs and re-edited them himself into, I think it was like either 1 or 2 movies, and took 3 movies, edited them down to 1 or 2, and it was the same fucking footage. Like, he just had the Blu-ray and he ripped the DVD or whatever, but he edited it differently, and everybody was like, this is a fucking masterpiece. It's not perfect. It's not perfect because, he's limited by what like I said before, the editor has at his disposal. But everybody was like, this is so much better than what we got. Even my dad, he doesn't edit or anything like that, has forever been begging me. He was like, can you just take the original Godfather and can you edit in all the deleted scenes that they put on the disc with it, the bonus features? Can you edit those into the movie for me? And I haven't ever done it, but I know he wants to do it, and I know other people have done stuff like that for other movies. And it's interesting because I've long considered doing that with some of my work, which was just go back, re-edit it, and not use stuff or put stuff in that I hadn't used before, whatever like that, and see how it comes across. Even if I didn't add things or take away things from digits, if I just went into the master file of that right now, I would edit it differently. I would look at the timeline and I would start adjusting and tweaking things so that a shot cuts out sooner, or you know what I'm saying? And that would change the experience altogether. So I'm curious to know from you, when you went back and you started changing things in Trailer Park Warlock, did you have that little angel and the devil on your shoulders where it was like, hey, a couple people told you this was fucked up, but what if it was good and you're fucking it up more? Like, it comes back to our second episode where it's like, at some point you just got to stop.
Yeah.
And this is a message directly aimed at George Lucas, but I'm curious to know your point of view on the edit, Rainwater. What point have you over-edited something to the point where you feel like you might have lost what you once had, like the magic?
I think the last time that I had that issue was back when I was doing Garage Raja, where there would be certain issues or certain chapters, however you want to call them, where me and Austin would go back and forth, and I would like add pages basically to expand on moments.
Wow.
And that was probably one of the few times where I felt like, oh, I need to be careful because I might be overcooking this. And that was definitely one of those situations where there were pages thrown out because it's like, oh, this is extraneous. We don't need it. This scene is not necessary, et cetera, et cetera. Trailer Park Warlock, it's a lot harder for me to do because the timeline for producing it requires me to be extremely efficient. So like, I don't get a lot of time to go back on things unless it's something like totally crucial to the story that needs to be adjusted. So if I'm ever going back in Trailer Park Warlock, it's because like there's some very crucial continuity error, or like there's a misspelling or a proofreading thing or whatever. And like I said, the only other exception to that was that one time where I had gotten to the end of an arc and did not put enough of a button on the scene that my audience felt like needed to be there, and I, to a certain extent, felt like it needed to be there, but at the time felt like, you know what, let's just see how it goes as is, right? And then after, hearing feedback back from it, that's when I went, okay, let's expand on this just enough so that it's not so that it's not feeling incomplete anymore. It's just enough expansion that people are not feeling like emotionally left out of the scene, or like it's suddenly abruptly cut to something totally else, which is how people felt when they had read it.
I'm jealous of you because I would be tempted to play with that ability to go back and edit as part of my storytelling. Like if I were you, I would be like, shit, I
5
need to
years
write
from now.
I was thinking I should write like if I were you,
Yeah.
I would write a time travel like storyline where Jake travels kind of like Back to the Future too,
Right.
and goes back to moments that previously happened, but I would change them in the original ones while that story was going on. So if anybody went back and they would be like, oh shit, look at this, da, 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 da. And then once the story had concluded and things were set back to normal, it would like be either righted or it would just be like a setup, like the brilliance of fucking Back to the Future.
There is like one thing in the story that has stuck out to me where a name is given for a character who otherwise does not have a name in the story. And it turns out that that character's name is the same as another character's name who's more prominent in the story. And I don't know what happened when I was writing it. Like I didn't think about it. And I just went back over it one day. I was like, oh fuck, like I'm reusing that name. And so originally I was like, oh, I should go back and change it. And now I'm like, no, I'm going to incorporate this into the story somehow. Like I have an idea that if I have the time, this entirely depends on whether or not I have the time to land it. But I'm basically at this point hinging the rest of the story on landing this one like what was originally an error and turning it into the entire purpose of the ending of like the series arc. Basically, we'll see how it goes.
I think that's something to kind of a brilliant note to kind of end the episode on, is that editing does allow you this brilliant thing of hindsight, where you know everything in front of you, things that you didn't know when you were writing, things that you didn't know while you were in production, for me or for you for while you were drawing it. But once it's all laid out in front of you, you can see it a lot better, and then you can kind of understand your own. And a lot of people, and if you're not an artist, you don't understand this. If you are an artist, you totally get what I'm about to say. Most of us don't understand our own story until we have gotten towards the end of it, like actually making it. Like once we have it in front of us, we have such a better idea of what it was we were trying to say. And that hindsight it's almost like I'm not the first person to say this, but it's the final rewrite. That's what editing becomes, is the final pass, the final draft of your story, where you look at it and go, oh, I don't need this. I do need this. And if I put that there, that makes this more important. Good thing I had that. Like that final pass becomes the final writing thing. So like when I got my first job out of college, it was as a video editor at a post house, and they did a lot of sports work. And if you know anything about me, I don't really care that much about sports. I'm competent. I can hold a conversation. I don't know where they are, what teams are where they are in the standings or whatever at the moment. But I was doing the job interview, and I remember the guy saying to me, he's like, oh, you're really big in sports. And I was up front. I was like, not really. And he was like, well, why do you think that you'd be a good fit for this job? And I was like, well, because, editing is storytelling. And, it doesn't really matter if I give a shit about Barry Bonds and his, 900th home run, but it's a big deal when I'm re-editing that particular baseball game to know, okay, I need to have the first, the second, the bottom of the fourth, and the top of the sixth innings, because that sets up everything for the home run to, be what it's got to be. And then after that, you check all the boxes where it's like, okay, it has to be an hour and a half. Well, the bottom of the third is this long, and and you fill in as you need to. But that hindsight is what allows you to do it. And once you understand the storytelling, you can kind of narrow in on all the things you need and don't need. And like I said, it's when you go to the store. Sometimes when I spoiler alert, sometimes I like to do painting, just in my free time to kind of relax. I don't post it. I don't really share it with anybody. It's just kind of a thing I do as like an exercise for me. And I'll go to the store and I'll be like, okay, I'm doing something fall. I'm going to need something brown. I'm going to need oranges. I'm going to need yellows, whites, blacks. Those are the colors I'm going to need. And then I'll get home and I'll realize, well, I didn't really need the yellow. I bought it, but I don't really need it. You know what I'm saying? So like that yellow paint just goes in a drawer and it's like, oh, I'll use it sometime if I don't need to. But when you're there gathering it, you don't know it until you get there. So when you get to that editing, it's not just making sense of it. It's not just about assembling and getting artsy with rhythm and all that kind of stuff, but it's really your last chance as a storyteller to hone in on the point. You know what I'm saying? Like, so that you understand it and that you know that the audience can understand it too. And that's another, not to drag out the end of this episode, but that's another thing that you need to be careful of. You need to be able to watch or reread your thing once you've done it and disassociate yourself from that entire process you just went through and try and watch it as someone who doesn't know anything. Oh, well, there was a water tube that exploded on set, so we couldn't shoot that way. And then there was a bus that went by, and like all those things don't fucking matter when someone's sitting in a movie theater watching your thing. They just want to know what's going on. James Cameron revealed a technique years ago that I actually implemented on digits. Because I was editing digits. When I edited, it would be I would assemble the cut of a scene, right? Because we were shooting it by scene, and I would go home. I was so excited. I would edit it that night, and then I would have the scene in front of me, and then I'd watch it again, and I would tweak it and clean it up. Watch it again, clean it and tweak it and clean it up. Done. Next scene, same process. Next scene, same process. Then I would put scene A, B, and C next to each other and go, all right, let me watch this through. Oh shit, that's kind of a jumpy. I need to change this here and change that there, because these scenes are playing differently in the whole versus just themselves. So I had to watch it that way. And then once I did that, it's repeated for 2 hours. And then I cannot tell you how many times I have watched a particular scene or a moment or a shot or whatever like that, just trying to get that timing just to right, yada, yada, yada. And then I have to change it when it's in the scope of everything. So I must have watched that movie 1,000,000 times. It's not an exaggeration. That's not hyperbole.
Yeah.
You were there at one point when I was watching it.
No, I definitely remember that.
Yeah. And it gets to be crazy. So James Cameron does a thing where he does the thing called a flop. It's an effect where you can swap. So like if I'm on the right side of the frame, it'll flop me. So I'm on the left side of the frame looking the other way.
Oh.
And James Cameron has found out that if you do this, if you have an entire timeline and you put a flop on it and you flip it, your brain is expecting your head to show up on the right side of the frame, but it doesn't. It shows up on the left. So your brain starts watching the movie as a new experience.
That's interesting.
And that's how he does his screenings for himself to disassociate from the work and see if it's working. Because yes, some things will get a little jumbled because you're expecting certain things and whatever like that. But for the most part, you're watching a new movie that you are immersed in because you don't know what to expect. Your brain is trying to guess what's going to happen. And it's important to do that because that's how your audience is going to see it. A lot of people, when they do work on like screenplays or this or that, myself included, I'll write a script and then I'll put it in a drawer and I'll leave it for like 3 months. So I don't remember scene to scene, the words, the verbiage I use, the dialogue, yada, 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 and I can come back and read it fresh. And that's not a luxury you have in film. And I'm assuming you don't have it either in comics, but because fucking deadlines are the deadline. And you got to get it done. And a lot of us are procrastinators and we wait until the last minute, not expecting that we do need a breather space to go back and check that final draft. But that edit, you have to disassociate yourself from your work before you give that final stamp of approval. And when you're editing, you have to keep that in mind. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. So, Rainwater, you look like you wanted to chime in, but I was on a rant, so feel free to throw in.
No, the only thing, the whole flop thing just reminded me about this is a general tip to drawing just in general, not just with comics. But if you're not feeling comfortable about maybe like a figure that you're drawing or a background or whatever, turn it upside down and look at it upside down. And you will immediately spot if you're having an issue with like the proportion of something or like, something's at just not quite the right angle, that'll get your mind set to orienting it and thinking about it in a holistic way. So very similar to what you're saying. It's like you suddenly are, it's a way of reorienting your mind to look at it from a different perspective so that you can definitively point out like what isn't working, because now you're able to repiece it together basically. So just to
see
really
differently.
to mirror what you're saying, like that's definitely one of the best tips that I can think of in terms of not just editing, but just like giving yourself feedback when others can't give it to you.
That's an episode in itself.
Yep.
All right, I think we've talked about this long enough. Go out there, get started. Make sure you, to summate what we talked about, make sure that when you are doing your edit, you are focused on narrowing in on the point, that it's making sense, that you're maintaining emotion, that you're establishing rhythm, that you're not violating 180 without a good reason. If you don't know what the 180 rule is, make sure you go check that out, Mr. Artists and Miss Artists and others out there. That I think was the my parents get so mad when I say this, but I justify the $120,000 price tag of art school to say I learned about the 180 rule. That's pretty much what I took away from art school. If you don't know what the 180 rule is, go and look it up. But yes, that's my suggestion to the artists and storytellers checking out this episode today. Edit, and then get away from it, view it, and edit some more. Edit until they take it away from you. That's because they're gonna at some point. The only downfall is when you're in charge of it, then you can really screw the pooch. Set your own deadline and stick to it. And you're not going to, so set a second deadline and stick to that one. Don't make a third deadline. I say two deadlines are the best way to do it, because the first one you will bullshit an excuse and say, well, I didn't know this was going to happen. Da, 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 da. That second deadline is the dead deadline. Like that's the way you should try and do it, especially because this is the way I look at everything. And I'm going to end up, I swear, I promise. Whenever I'm looking at anything, I always, and this is a life lesson that I like to tell people, and I'm going to preach it to my children. You always have less time than you think you have.
Yep.
That applies to fucking everything.
Yep.
Everything in life. You have less time than you think you have. So make the most of it. Get shit done. Good night.